Hello and welcome to this episode of Digitally. If data is so important, why is it so hard to get it right? The reality is, as business grows, data sprawls across countless systems in an array of formats at differing levels of consistency and at a scale that is ever expanding. And the challenge isn't just about collecting the information, it's actually about connecting the dots. But all of this has to be solved, and some best approaches are clearly emerging now. And to help unpack, I'm very excited to welcome a great friend and a colleague and a fellow member of the Executive Technology Board, a Fortune 500 company CIO, Annie Baymiller. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's great to be here.
Well, I just want to tell my audience that, Annie, you've been leading enterprise-wide digital transformation. And at the same time, you're building a scalable architecture so you can pivot the company quickly. You're strengthening cybersecurity, you're building out core infrastructure, and you're creating a culture that treats data as a true strategic asset, and all in the world of a global manufacturing corporation. And so with distributed operations, variety of countries, and manufacturing at its core. And so I thought you would be a fantastic person to come on today and help us essentially unpack what's happening in the world of data, particularly in large, complex business environments. And so maybe to get started, Annie, you can just give us a sense of lay of the land and where and how data sits in your corporation.
Yeah, it's a great topic. And I think it's one of the most strategic elements that companies need to be focused on getting right is really that data foundation piece. And we've been at this for 5-10 years to really come with our strategy around where data should sit, how we make sure it's closest to the people who have the big business problems to solve. But for us, it's really been centralizing the bulk of our data. There's data everywhere, data that we make, data that we can go get. And so knowing proactively how, as you said, it all has to fit together so that it can be additive to the insight we're trying to create has helped us then, from a centralization point of view, streamline the curation of the data and also get to that insight faster, which is the overall outcome, right? Data by itself is just interesting unless it's actionable.
And Annie, what I find really remarkable about your operation, we all talk about first party, second party, third party. So customer data as a topic is really well understood. And obviously anything that relates to business insights and driving business decisions. But you've got the whole OT operating technology environment with telemetry and your manufacturing flows and such. That's got to add a dimension of complexity beyond kind of the normal, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a big focus area for us right now. We've really taken a big effort in this year and going forward on our digital manufacturing presence because we're a global company. We've got 25,000 employees in 30 countries and hundreds of manufacturing facilities. And so figuring out which pieces need to stay local because they solve the problem at that specific manufacturing facility, and how do we keep that secure but actionable in the hands of those people that need to make those decisions. And then what are the things that we actually want to pull back into the center because we want to be able to make more holistic decisions or more regional decisions. And so that's a huge focus area for us. And I think anybody who's in that position of having the ability for decentralized data, but knowing that real value can come from centralizing it, it's an architecture decision that we've been leaning into.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that because, as you say, the architecture of this is really really important. It's easy to move, it's easy to store data, it's easy to process data, but moving data is actually super expensive. And then, what to keep where, as opposed to the core and the edge, is actually an important decision. How are you just set up architecturally on your data infrastructure?
Yeah, the majority of it is hosted centrally, and that's probably been a byproduct of the types of decisions we've been trying to make. And so we run, we have 3 big business units: insulation, roofing, and doors. And while they're different in terms of the markets and the way we go to market, lots of times when we find that one analytics solution that serves one business really well, we find that we can scale it to the other business units and really get enterprise leverage. So the centralization of the data has allowed us to scale those use cases faster, and it allows us to make sure that the data stays trusted and secure in a way that we feel very confident about that. Now, the manufacturing is a little bit of a different animal because we have obviously a manufacturing footprint that allows us to look at that local versus enterprise. And it really has been coming down to what decisions are we trying to make and who's the right person to make those decisions to figure out if it stays, near the edge or if there's value in bringing it, as you said, moving it into the center, which has its own complexities.
Well, I've got to imagine also because you're in different countries, you've got kind of the whole regulatory environment around residency and sovereignty and so on and so forth. And even in that environment, figuring out what you bring in.
Yes,
Um,
yeah, and that's changing every day, right? And there's going to be, I'm sure, especially as AI continues to scale, and there's more data that can be created and used. I think the discussions around regulatory compliance, privacy are all going to continue to be at the forefront of how companies have to make those decisions.
Okay, so we've got the basics out on the table. We know the size and scope and the amount of work you're doing in the data space. We know it's a complex topic. Let's now start unpacking a little bit of the keys to success and your learnings as you've gone through it. And I know you've done a tremendous amount of work here. My first question actually goes to something that I think is often mentioned but missed in depth, which is the operating model, right? Who owns what? How does it sit? Where does it belong? How do you get accountability? Talk to us a little bit about A, where you are, and B, how did you get on that journey?
Yeah, very good. So the operating model, I think, stemmed from the data residency and foundation. So if we knew that was going to be centralized, we said, look, let's make sure that the way we approach the trust and the accuracy of that data is also centralized. So it's really evolved into what I would call a hub and spoke model. And so the hub is our data architects, our data scientists, the folks who are well connected to the businesses to understand the core problems around anything from, traditional reporting to advanced analytics to the investigation around AI capabilities. So that's the hub that sits here within IT. And then the spokes are either analytics and data scientists who are sprinkled into the business to move fast at the edge, or people that just have that curiosity and enthusiasm to know what are the big business problems we're trying to solve and how do I get that back into the hub to go create solutions. So then we can create something that is useful for a spoke and then go make sure that we're applying it to all of the other spokes and so businesses and functions to make sure they're getting the most value out of it. So it served us really well because it keeps us connected to the businesses, connected to the functions, people that are waking up every day needing to make those decisions. But the actual management, the data accuracy, the data foundations, and then the skill sets that we know we need from a technical point of view, we can keep those centralized, which has been good for us.
I think just to push at that a little bit, Annie, and maybe to learn from you, I think on the consumption side of the data, I completely get it in terms of centralizing and having a kind of a SWAT team and people that kind of can both get deep into it, but also leverage across businesses. On the bit around the production side, or in other words, I just want to get to this messiness of data. The real challenge with data ends up being that it's messy, it's dirty, it's not accurate, it's not consistent. And so the cleansing of that and the setting the structure is a really hard work. And I've often heard, and we've experienced this ourselves, that kind of doing it centrally sometimes becomes difficult because you have to have enough of a understanding of the nuance of the business and the context to be able to cleanse it, if you will, or get to quality. How do you manage quality in this hub and spoke? Who owns it?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a shared responsibility, right? I think from the data models, the data structures, how it's hosted, how it's stored, I think that is largely an IT accountability to make sure that we own that. But we definitely, for every data set that we curate, we have a business owner who's accountable for it as well, right? To make sure that they're able to validate the accuracy of it and then also be able to be kind of that pulse check too, to be able to make sure that there's always a human in the loop as we're scaling things and trying things out. So I totally agree. It's a shared partnership where you've got to have enough context to what the data is used for to appreciate if it's the right data, enough of the data, and if it's in the right hands.
Yeah. One of the best practices I've seen, and maybe you do this now, maybe I've seen it elsewhere, is actually running the entire business on on the analytics that you produce, so that if the data is wrong, it gets questioned in the right
Yeah.
forums and the accountability gets back. Otherwise, if you're using a shadow system, then it becomes very difficult to get the
Yeah.
awareness of quality.
I agree. And I think we're on that journey too. I think as most companies are, is how do you bring more data-driven decision making in? How do you bring more automation and let the
Right.
data add to business insights? And for us, that'll be, running things in parallel at the same time, right? We always want that human in the loop still who says, yeah, that feels directionally correct, or oh my, there's clearly an anomaly in there that we need to go understand. So that level of business context and being able to connect the dots is super important.
Excellent. So we talked a little bit about architecture, which is important. We talked a little bit about operating model and getting the culture and the ownership and accountability. Obviously, the third leg of the stool is responsibility and responsible AI and ethics, and obviously the regulatory component, the sovereignty component, and governance. Talk to us a little bit about A, what you're doing, B, what you're learning.
Very good. We've actually created a forum for this we call the Responsible AI Community of Practice. And it's a combination of information security, of legal, of compliance, of sourcing, and then also the regions to make sure that those folks who are closest to what's evolving from a regulatory point of view are in the mix. And we intentionally separated it from the hub and spoke model, which is more about ideation and scale and adoption, so that we could only bring, once we're ready to take one of those new big ideas, we bring that to the responsible AI group so they can look very objectively, but very pragmatically too, in terms of what we're actually going to go do. And so they help to put the guardrails around it from a governance point of view, where they're thinking just in terms of, the risk, the compliance, the complexity, and how once we get to a point of scale, then how do we ensure that that continues to be secured in the appropriate way? So it's serving us well having those be kind of two separate forums where one is all about energy and enthusiasm and ideation. And then once we get those ideas we're really excited about, these eyes are the right people to then go make sure, let's go do it and let's figure out how we do it in the best way, the most safe way for the company and for our customers, our markets.
I love the fact that you've called it around AI as opposed to just data, because data, if you constrain it just to data, it can be around regulatory and compliance and so forth. But when you get into AI, then you get into things like unintended use,
Yes.
biases. So it's not just about data, but how data gets used to make decisions. That's fascinating. Listen, those three areas were the ones I want to explore. But what else can you tell us? What do you want to lead? If I am a new CIO going into a role like yours, what are two or three things you'd want me to walk away and just keep in mind as I kind of take on some of the problems you've taken on so far?
I think two things. One, this has been years of work to get the data into the position that it's in today, right? Where we feel really good about our foundation. And so I'm extremely proud of the team that we were very proactive on this and we've been working on this. If you're new in role and it doesn't feel like it's where it needs to be, you really need to make sure you resource it and fund it appropriately, because it's going to be really hard to take advantage of generative AI, agentic AI, advanced analytics, unless you have a data foundation that's trusted. So don't underestimate the volume of the work, but how useful it is once ready. And then second, think about the operating model in a way of how do you make sure you keep control over, data is kind of a crown jewel for your company, right? So how do you keep control over that? But how do you get the insights and the ideas as close to the business as possible, the people that know what the real problems are? And if you can get that hub and spoke or whatever model is best for you, I think that's where you really start to get the momentum.
I love it, because I think what you really just said is don't build for today, build for tomorrow. So it's a foundation. It's the base for all these new things to come. And there's a lot more coming there. And if you don't get started early, then you're behind already. And I think I love the other point about operating model, because in my experience, where all of the technology eventually breaks is actually the operating model and the processes to kind of get it right. And
Yep.
your advice of getting that set up, and it could be hub and spoke, it could be different models, but this concept of shared accountability and ownership and all in is a mindset that I think we could definitely take away. And as always, it's fantastic talking to you. I learn so much every time I speak with you. Thank you for joining us today from
Thanks
our
for having
audience.
me.
Thank you as well. We'll talk to you soon. And for our audience, Annie's on LinkedIn. If you want to reach out to both of us, we're happy to hear views and perspectives and tell us something that we didn't know, we'd love to hear.
Perfect.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone.